Friends, in the previous lecture, I was speaking to you from in front of the Dead Sea. That was the context in which we discussed the punishment stories of the Quran. Of course, the setting of the Dead Sea was appropriate because by tradition, it's the spot where Lot and his people were, the people who were destroyed by God's punishment, which explains why the land there is so barren, of course, according to tradition. We spoke about the way that the Quran has this repeating theme of peoples who don't believe in God and God's messenger and are destroyed by God for their unbelief. How this happens with biblical characters such as Noah and Lot and Moses, but also to non-biblical characters known to us only from the Quran, such as Hud and Salih. This threat of destruction during your life is meant for the Quran to be one of the strategies the Quran uses to convince its audience to believe in its message. Again, we return to the theme of the Quran as exhortation. But what about the case of peoples who aren't destroyed? What about the case of those unbelievers who have lived long, maybe wealthy, comfortable lives and are now in their graves? Why didn't God destroy them? The Quran seems to anticipate these questions by other passages which describe heaven and hell, which suggest that even those who escape God's punishment in this life will be punished by God in the next life. And that brings us to the topic of this lecture, which is the question of heaven and hell. We already touched a bit on the Quranic descriptions of heaven and hell in the third lecture of the first section of the course, where we discussed the Quran's qualities, both its rhymes and its tone and its quality as a book of exhortation. Here we'll get into a bit more detail about what the Quran actually says about heaven and actually says about hell. Once again, the point here is to look at the strategies that the Quran uses to convince its audience of its message. And here we can think of its intimate, or rather detailed descriptions of heaven and hell as a sort of strategy. The Quran's interest in not only mentioning a heavenly reward or a punishment in hell, but giving great details about what that reward or that punishment will be like. All of that is best viewed as part of its strategy to convince its audience of its message. Let's use one example, Quran 55, which speaks of the pains of hell that await unbelievers and the pleasures of heaven that await believers. Here, this passage, unlike an earlier passage we've read from Quran 56, which began with heaven and then turned to hell, this passage begins with hell and then turns to heaven. And the interesting point of this passage is that it has its refrain, like all of Surah 55, which we've read for this section, it has this refrain, "So which of your Lord's marvels will you deny?" to which the Quran turns time and again. Let's read just a brief passage, beginning with verse 41. Here we begin with a description of hell. "The guilty will be recognized by their marks. They will be taken by the forelocks and the feet. So which of your Lord's marvels will you deny? This is hell that the guilty denied. They circulate between it and between a seething bath. So which of your Lord's marvels will you deny? But for him who feared the standing of his Lord are two gardens." Here the Quran turns to heaven. "So which of your Lord's marvels will you deny? Full of variety. So which of your Lord's marvels will you deny? In them are two flowing springs. So which of your Lord's marvels will you deny? In them are fruits of every kind in pairs." These vivid descriptions are not limited to Quran 55, Surah 55. Afterlife is a central theme of the Quran. And in this, the Quran departs from the Bible. In the Old Testament, we have hardly any mention of afterlife at all, neither of heaven nor of hell. In the New Testament, we have general descriptions or metaphors, such as the wedding feast for heaven, or the darkness outside where there's gnashing of teeth for hell. The Quran seems to be closer in spirit to a way that Christian preachers at the time and place of the Quran's origins spoke about heaven and hell as a way to make an impression on their audience. For example, the Syrian father Ephraim wrote a famous reflection on paradise, which is entirely dedicated to describing the pleasures of paradise. Thus, the Quran has nothing general in its descriptions of heaven and hell. All three surahs that we read for this subsection of our edX course, not only Quran 55, but the others, include sections on heaven and hell. Let's give some examples from these other passages. The Quran in Surah 11 speaks of those who fail to submit to God and are sent to the fires of hell in verses 14 to 16. In the other surah we read, Quran 37, In the opening section, we have talk of the day of resurrection, or rather in verse 21, the day of separation, when the believers will be separated from unbelievers. The unbelievers, or the sinners, will taste a painful punishment, verse 38, and the believers will be offered a cup of pure drink, and with them will be bashful women with lovely eyes. Here then in Quran 37, we mention now for the first time in this course, we have a reference to the women of paradise who will be offered to believers. These passages raise a series of questions about heaven and hell in the Quran. And to conclude this lecture, we'll address all of them. First, question number 1, why does the Quran have such vivid descriptions of heaven and hell? This brings us back to the theme of exhortation, that the Quran is a book with an argument to make and wants to use strategies that will make an impression on its audience. And presumably the best way, for example, to explain the presence of women or virgins of paradise in the Quran is with the Quran's effort to come up with images or come up with ideas or possibilities that would make a positive impression to have its audience yearn for heaven. In order to understand this Quran's interest in inspiring or provoking its audience to believe, we might remember the Arabic expression that's mentioned in the reading we've had for this section in chapter 4 of the book, The Emergence of Islam. According to some Muslims, the Quran is best understood as a book of targhib wa tarhib, that is, arousing desire and instilling fear. This is what the Quran does. It both arouses desire for heaven and instills fear of hell. The importance of instilling the fear of hell is seen in the writing of a conservative Sunni mufti or jurisprudent, a Saudi who's very influential but has very conservative positions, named Al-Munajjid. He fields a question on his website, Islam QA, in which the questioner asks about the punishment of hell, whether it should be understood symbolically or really, or how it can go with the mercy of God. And Munajjid comments, many ignorant people rely on the mercy of God and his forgiveness and kindness, and they ignore his commands and prohibitions, and forget that he is severe in punishment, and he does not ward off his wrath from evildoers. Question number 2 about heaven and hell in the Quran. Why is belief the criterion or the standard which separates the damned from the blessed? Why does the Quran seem to focus on heaven as a reward for believers and hell as a punishment for unbelievers? It's not necessarily the immoral, the unethical, the sinners, although those ideas or descriptions of the damned are brought up, but above all it's the unbelievers, or according to the Arabic term kuffar, who are sent to hell, and it's the believers who are sent to heaven. Why is belief so important to the Quran? Here we have the first hint of something that we'll return to again in this course, about the nature of the Quran's interest in theology. For the Quran, literally what you say about God, and that's the meaning of that word theology, God speak. What you say about God matters. What you say about God is a moral act. Saying the right thing about God, and for the Quran this means acknowledging that Allah, the God of the Quran, alone deserves worship, alone is mighty, alone is powerful. Saying the right thing about God, acknowledging those things, is what gets you into heaven. Saying the wrong thing about God, and for the Quran that's attributing power to something other than God, or worshiping something other than God, saying the wrong thing about God is what gets you into hell. Finally, question number 3. Why is heaven described as a garden in the Quran? This is an interesting question. Heaven doesn't seem to be a spiritual domain, but it seems to be a garden. Now, there's different ways of answering this question. We could say simply that the Quran is interested in providing a physical place because it's interested, as we've mentioned, in arousing desire for heaven. So it wants to give a physical place where physical pleasures can be enjoyed, and there's some truth in that. Some people have imagined that the Quran speaks of a garden, or rather of heaven as a garden, because the Prophet was preaching to a people who lived in the desert, who lived in barren surroundings, who dreamed all the time about lush green places, who dreamed of the gardens of some far-off land that was well watered. Muhammad, in order to arouse their desire for heaven, pictured heaven as sort of the fulfillment of all of those desires. But the best way to understand the depiction of the Quran, its depiction rather of heaven as a garden, is to have a conception of the Quran's cosmology, by which I mean the way that the Quran speaks about all of the cosmos or the universe. According to the Quran's cosmology, humanity, that is Adam and Eve in the beginning, came from the Garden of Eden. And this Garden of Eden seems to be, according to the Quran, in heaven itself. Garden of Eden is not in some place in Mesopotamia, on earth, but rather in heaven itself. Maybe, and we'll get back to this point, on the top of something like a cosmic mountain, the peak of which enters into the celestial realm. Adam and Eve, after their sin, were sent down from the heavenly garden into the earthly realm. And the Quran seems to promise that when the blessed will be sent to paradise, they'll be sent back to this same garden. This place, these gardens, according to the Quranic phrase, beneath which rivers flow. Thus, in the Quran's vision, the destiny of humanity at the end of time, heaven, what God is calling humans to, is the same place where history first began. The Garden of Adam and Eve is the same place as the paradise of the believers in the afterlife.